Good afternoon and welcome to Lunch Break Live with Tea Party Patriots Action. I'm Bill Pasco, Tea Party Patriots man in Washington, and I'm flying solo this week. I'll be delivering both the Washington Report and the call to action. Let's get right to it. The House and Senate will come back Monday and stay in session through Thursday. Last week in the House came back on Tuesday and voted to pass two bills under suspension of the rules. On Wednesday, the House passed a rule governing floor consideration of two bills. On Thursday, the House passed those two bills, H.R. 27, the Halt Fentanyl Act, and H.R. 26, the Protecting American Energy Production Act. And then they were done. This week in the House will come back today with the first vote set for 6:30 p.m. At that time, the House is scheduled to consider six bills under suspension of the rules. On Tuesday, and for the balance of the week, the House will consider two bills pursuant to a rule, H.R. 77, the Midnight Rules Relief Act, and H.R. 35, the Agent Raul Gonzalez Officer Safety Act. Last week in the Senate came back on Monday and voted to agree to the motion to proceed to executive session to consider the nomination of Russell Vought to serve as Director of the Office of Management and Budget. Then the Senate voted to confirm Christopher Wright to serve as Secretary of Energy. Then the Senate voted to end debate on the nomination of Pam Bondi to serve as Attorney General. On Tuesday, the Senate voted to confirm Doug Collins to be Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Then the Senate voted to confirm Scott Turner to serve as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. On Wednesday, the Senate voted to confirm him to that position. They voted to end debate on it on Tuesday. They voted to confirm Turner on Wednesday. Then the Senate voted to end debate on the nomination of Russell Vought to serve as Director of the Office of Management and Budget. On Thursday evening at around 7 p.m., after Senate Democrats had used up every last minute of the 30 hours of post-cloture debate time, the Senate voted to confirm Vought to serve as Director of OMB. Then the Senate began a series of votes on procedural matters from which I will spare you. Suffice it to say that over the next 3 hours, Senate Democrats forced Republicans to go through 11 votes just so they could set up confirmation votes for this week on Tulsi Gabbard, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Howard Lutnick, Brooke Rollins, and Kelly Loeffler. And then they were done. So this week in the Senate will come back today with the first vote set for 5:30 p.m. At that time, the Senate will proceed to a roll call vote on the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard to serve as Director of National Intelligence. Then, based on the Majority Leader's cloture filings, I anticipate we'll see confirmation votes on the nominations of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to serve as Secretary of Health and Human Services, Howard Lutnick to serve as Secretary of Commerce, Brooke Rollins to serve as Secretary of Agriculture, and Kelly Loeffler to serve as Administrator of the Small Business Administration. Let's stick with cabinet confirmations. So far, the Senate has confirmed 13 of President Trump's cabinet nominees. They include the Secretaries of State, Defense, Treasury, Homeland Security, Interior, Transportation, Energy, Veterans Affairs, Housing and Urban Development, the Attorney General, and the directors of the Central Intelligence Agency and the Office of Management and Budget, and the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. If all goes as planned this week, that number will grow from 13 to 18. One other move on cabinet confirmations we're tracking: the Judiciary Committee met last Thursday to vote on the confirmation of Kash Patel to serve as Director of the FBI. Committee Democrats invoked a committee rule to postpone the meeting for 1 week. It was nothing out of the ordinary. It happens regularly, and Republicans do it to Democrats too when Republicans are in the minority. It changes absolutely nothing other than the date on which the Patel confirmation vote will take place. So that meeting was rescheduled for 1 week later and will now take place this Thursday. I don't expect any troubles for Patel in committee or on the floor. Now let's talk about the Gaza Strip. On Tuesday, the hurricane that is President Trump unleashed itself on the gathered White House press corps, assembled in the East Room for a press conference with Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu. In the time it takes to do one press conference, that is about 45 minutes, Trump remade 6 decades worth of U.S. policy in the Middle East, rejecting the long-held policy known as the two-state solution in favor of what he called a long-term U.S. takeover of the Gaza Strip, in which 2 million Palestinians would be relocated to Egypt and Jordan, while a U.S.-led redevelopment project gets to work for the next 10 to 15 years. Quote, "The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip," said Trump. "I do see a long-term ownership position, and I see it bringing great stability to that part of the Middle East, and maybe the entire Middle East," end quote. He said he believed Gaza would become, quote, "the Riviera of the Middle East." He said nothing about how the U.S. would persuade the Palestinians to leave. He did not rule out sending U.S. armed forces to hold Gaza, but he did not commit U.S. forces to patrol on the ground in Gaza. On Friday, responding to reporters' questions, Trump said he believed Israel would give the land to the United States. Stay tuned. Now, let's talk about DOGE and its moves to shrink government. Where to begin? Let's start with this. The Department of Government Efficiency, many expected, was a government bureau that would send out auditors to conduct investigations of ongoing programs and projects in the various agencies that make up the federal government, with a view to finding cost savings by discovering wasteful spending and maybe even some or even a ton of corruption. It would issue a long report that would be turned into talking points and a few executive actions and maybe even proposed legislation that would then be haggled over by the Congress. Instead, we've got a T-shirted crew of young software engineers commandeering personnel information systems and shutting down funding streams and making recommendations on firing civil service employees that would make even the most aggressive team of Bobs blush. The recommendation for the United States Agency for International Development, also known as USAID, is perhaps the most blunt, but also, we are told, what we should expect across the government. DOGE wants to shrink the workforce at USAID from 10,000 employees to 294. Let that sink in for a moment. From 10,000 to 294, that's less than 3% its current size. In previous attempts at shrinking government, we considered it good news if an auditor found ways to suggest cutting spending by 3%. Now it's the reverse. The auditors are suggesting they've found ways to cut spending by 97%, leaving just 3% of the original spend intact. And I, for one, love the attention to detail. DOGE didn't suggest USAID could shrink its workforce from 10,000 to 300 people. No, they said they could cut from 10,000 to exactly 294. That level of detail indicates the precision with which they are approaching their mission. USAID, it turns out, was an excellent choice to serve as DOGE's first agency to face examination. In the 2 weeks since the DOGE team first showed up at USAID, we've learned an awful lot about how the agency functions and what it's been funding. For instance, Catherine Harridge reported that USAID had funded a college education for Anwar al-Awlaki, the first American citizen to be droned by the CIA. He was a leader of al-Qaeda in Yemen, and he got the funding for his college education by lying to USAID and falsely claiming to have been born in Yemen. Truly remarkable. We also learned in the initial document dump that USAID spent $375 million on DEI grants and $520 million on ESG consultants, and that $1.2 billion was given to what were described as undisclosed recipients. Stay tuned. Now let's talk about Russ Vought moving to shrink government. Russ Vought was confirmed by the Senate to serve as director of the Office of Management and Budget on Thursday evening. He didn't waste any time. On Friday night, he took over the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, also known as the CFPB, as acting director, joining Marco Rubio as a cabinet-level officer wearing multiple hats at the same time. President Trump had, just last week, removed Rohit Chopra, the Biden-era CFPB chief, and put in his place as acting director Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. That title and authority now passes to Vought, who emailed top staff at the agency Friday night to inform them of the change. Vought on Saturday informed the Federal Reserve that CFPB would, quote, not be taking its next draw of unappropriated funding because it is not, quote, reasonably necessary, unquote, to carry out its duties. The Bureau's current balance of $711.6 million is in fact excessive in the current fiscal environment. This spigot, long contributing to CFPB's unaccountability, is now being turned off, end quote. The CFPB is not funded by congressional appropriations, which has been a sore spot with Republicans ever since the agency was created in 2011. In the wake of the financial crisis of 2008. Vought also informed CFPB staff in an email on Saturday evening that they were instructed to cease, quote, all supervision and examination activity, end quote, and, quote, all stakeholder engagement, end quote, thereby shutting down the agency's operations. He reiterated the order that had been given last week by Acting Director Bessent that staff should not issue any new rules or guidance and that they should stop all investigations. Again, stay tuned. Now to the latest on the reconciliation strategy. Congressional Republican leaders have been having a hard time finalizing their reconciliation strategy. Maybe that's because there are so many balls in the air, so many things that have to be decided. Let's review. First, there's President Trump's ask force. He wants the expiring provisions of his 2017 tax cuts to be made permanent. He wants to lift taxes on overtime pay, tips, and on Social Security benefits paid to seniors. He wants to raise taxes on sports team owners, and he wants to eliminate the carried interest deduction, which is another way of saying he wants to raise taxes on hedge fund managers. And he wants to reduce the corporate tax rate from 21% to 15%. According to the Congressional Budget Office, making permanent the portions of the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act tax cuts that were not originally made permanent, in other words, the tax cuts that will expire at the end of this year unless the law is changed, will, quote, cost, unquote, $4.6 trillion. That's because the CBO scores a reduction in rates as a dollar-for-dollar loss of revenue to the Treasury, without taking into account the dynamic growth impact of cutting tax rates, which has been shown to generate so much additional economic activity that even though rates are lower, revenues generated can be higher. When you add in the projected costs of the other changes Trump wants made to the tax code, the total cost comes out to be about $5.5 trillion over a decade. Then there's the so-called hardliners in the House, largely but not totally made up of the House Freedom Caucus, plus some others, like Budget Committee Chairman Jody Arrington of Texas. Their ask for is $5.5 trillion in spending cuts over 10 years, scored the way CBO scores spending. That is, if you plan to increase spending by $6 trillion over the next decade, but you only increase spending by $1 trillion, you call that a $5 trillion spending cut, even though you're still spending more money over the next 10 years than if you hadn't increased spending at all. Yes, that's right. That's how a $1 trillion spending increase that you and I would recognize as a spending increase becomes, in the language of Washington budgeting, a $5 trillion spending cut. Let me stop right there and note that trying to save $5.5 trillion over a decade would require significant savings. I'm not at all sure there are 218 votes in the House to do that. That's one of the reasons House Ways and Means Committee Chairman Jason Smith of Missouri is so adamant that all of this has to fit inside one bill. He knows it's going to be hard to get approval for the tax changes he wants to make, so he wants to have the sweeteners of border security provisions and defense spending provisions and energy development provisions to throw into the same bill as an inducement to pry loose a few votes that he doesn't think he can get if the bill is limited only to changing tax law. Speaker Johnson and the rest of the top leadership seem to agree with him. On the Senate side, they see things differently. They don't think there's any way in the world they're going to be able to put together such a complex tax bill in such a short period of time. They are firmly of the belief that such a gargantuan tax bill will require many months of discussions and haggling, even just among Republicans. So they tell the president he should split the pile of ask-fors into two piles. The first pile limited to all the things he wants that can be done quickly, like the energy and defense and border security provisions, with the second pile, the tougher to agree on pile, waiting for a second bill to come later. Senate Republicans, led by Budget Committee Chairman Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, have apparently settled on a first reconciliation bill that will come in at about $340 billion, with $150 billion devoted to additional spending on border security, more Border Patrol agents, more ICE agents, more immigration courts and judges and staff, more detention facilities and the like, and $150 billion for increased defense spending to address the Biden administration's continual underfunding of our defense needs, and another $40 billion for energy development and other things. It would all be offset by an equivalent amount of spending cuts to be determined. The Senate Republican plan says nothing about taxes one way or the other, because Senate Republicans want to split the bills into two and save the tax portion for a second bill to come later. Last week, Senator Graham revealed his plan and said he intended to mark up a budget resolution in his committee this week on Wednesday and Thursday. Speaker Johnson said, "Hold on there, fella, not so fast," and said House Republicans were really close to finalizing their agreement. And if you'd just be kind enough to give him just a few more moments, he'd have it printed out for you. That was his line on Thursday, coming out of a 4-hour meeting with President Trump and senior White House aides, and then again on Friday and on Sunday from the Super Bowl. As of this writing, Monday morning, we're still waiting to see the language for House Republicans' consensus budget reconciliation package. Stay tuned. Tariffs are back. Quote, "The president is fighting a drug war, not a trade war," unquote. So explained Peter Navarro, the Trump administration's senior counselor for trade and manufacturing, describing President Trump's plan to impose 25% tariffs against Mexico and Canada in his effort to pressure the two countries to step up their own work to shut down the cross-border traffic in illegal narcotics and illegal aliens. President Trump is using tariffs, or more accurately, the threat of tariffs, as a tool of foreign and national security policy, not economic policy. This should not surprise anyone, either here at home or abroad. Since the 1980s, Trump's has been a consistent voice in favor of using tariffs to fight back against trading partners he believes have taken advantage of us, and to induce behavioral changes in other countries. He used them in his first term in office, and even for the same purpose against the same country, to motivate Mexico to do more to arrest the flow of illegal immigration into the United States. In May of 2019, even as his administration was negotiating the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement to replace NAFTA, Trump threatened to impose a 5% tariff on all imports from our largest trading partner if he wasn't satisfied that Mexico was increasing its efforts, quote, "to greatly reduce or eliminate illegal immigration coming from Mexico and into the United States," end quote. He issued that threat on May 30 of 2019. By June 7th, Mexico caved. Mexico agreed to take new steps to help stop the flow of illegal immigration into the United States. Trump said the agreement included a pledge by Mexico to move 6,000 troops to Mexico's southern border with Guatemala, the source of much of the illegal immigration that passes through Mexico into the United States. Mexico also agreed to house immigrants seeking asylum in the U.S. while the U.S. government adjudicated their requests. This was the basis of the Remain in Mexico policy that was so successful in helping control illegal immigration across our southern border. Trump doesn't merely threaten tariffs, though, as his first-term tariffs against China show. He's actually willing to impose them and make them stick. He began in 2018 imposing tariffs on solar panels and washing machines, then added tariffs on steel and aluminum imports and other items. Many of those tariffs were kept in place and even expanded by Joe Biden. And let's not forget Trump's earlier use of a tariff threat in his second term in office, when just a week after taking the oath of office for the second time, Colombia's president refused at first to accept returning deportees from the United States. Trump could not have hoped for anything better. Upon being informed of Colombia's refusal to accept its own returning deportees, Trump immediately threatened to impose tariffs unless the Colombian president relented. It didn't take long. The Colombian president didn't just agree immediately to accept the returning deportees. He deployed Colombia's presidential plane to retrieve some of them. Quote, "The government of Colombia has agreed to all of President Trump's terms, including the unrestricted acceptance of all illegal aliens from Colombia returned from the United States, including on U.S. military aircraft, without limitation or delay," said a statement released by the White House press secretary. Quote, "Today's events make clear to the world that America is respected again. President Trump will continue to fiercely protect our nation's sovereignty, and he expects all other nations of the world to fully cooperate in accepting the deportation of their citizens illegally present in the United States," end quote. America's is the world's largest economy. According to the latest figures from the World Bank, the U.S. has by far the largest economy in the world. Our closest competitor, China, had a 2023 GDP of $17.7 trillion, compared to the United States GDP in 2023 of $27.7 trillion. In other words, our economy is more than half again as big as China's. And Mexico? Mexico's economy generated a 2023 GDP of $1.8 trillion. That's about 6% the size of ours. That imbalance gives Trump a huge advantage on the international front. Everyone wants and needs access to the U.S. economy, the U.S. market. It's not like they can find a market that big anywhere else. If they want to be involved in international commerce, they want to be in the U.S. market. That simple fact, in Trump's hands, becomes a weapon he can wield on behalf of his desired outcomes, a sword he can carry into whatever discussion he wants. All he has to do is threaten to unsheath it from its scabbard. His actions in his first term, and even in his second term, before he's even been back in office for a full month, show international leaders he's willing to use that weapon if he feels the need. To him, tariffs aren't a tool of economic policy as much as they're a weapon of foreign and national security policy. He's wielding them on our behalf to make America great again, as the American people want. Now to the Jenny Beth Show. Episode 106 of the Jenny Beth Show dropped last Wednesday, featuring Jenny Beth's discussion with Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Waller, USMC retired, president of the Center for Security Policy. CSP was founded by former Reagan administration defense official Frank Gaffney more than 30 years ago, and for all that time it has been one of the leading think tanks in Washington concerned with ensuring America's national security. Jenny Beth's discussion with Tommy Waller touches on a wide variety of topics, from recruitment problems in the armed forces to China, with a special deep dive on the potential effects of a high-altitude electromagnetic pulse blast that fries electronics all over the country. Highly recommended. And that's our Washington report for this week. Now for the call to action. This week we're focusing on USAID. You've been reading about it, and I talked about it earlier in this broadcast. Your tax dollars are being wasted. Your tax dollars are going to fund outrageous projects abroad. Transgender surgeries on children in Guatemala. A transgender-themed comic book in Peru. Promotion of diversity, equity, and inclusion in Serbia's workplaces, and more. Simply put, USAID has not been accountable to Congress, as the Constitution requires. It's time to speak up and let Congress know that Americans want to defund, and close USAID permanently. We've put together 2 action pages where you can easily and quickly reach your members of Congress, as well as targeted lists of members, such as committee and subcommittee members that handle appropriations for USAID. This way, you can spend 2 minutes of your time to let them know it's time to close the doors at USAID forever. First, go to our Defund and Close USAID action page to contact the relevant U.S. House subcommittee members, the relevant Senate subcommittee members, the congressmen who voted to end funding for USAID previously, and a list of the congressmen who voted to keep fully funding USAID. Second, you can visit our Align Act campaign, where you can contact your own congressmen and senators to tell them it's time to defund and shut down USAID. Filling out these 2 forms will only require a couple of minutes. Additionally, the most effective way to contact them is by phone. If you can spare another couple of minutes after filling out the forms, which will send your emails automatically, please also use the options to call as well. Don't let this opportunity pass by to actually downsize government and make it more accountable to we the people. Take action now. As always, if you want to reach out to us, just send an email to jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. That's jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. And if you want me to answer a question live on air, just put "for broadcast" in the subject line. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back next week, same time, same place. Until then, be well and be active.